The evolution of sign language has developed greatly over time. These arrangements of signs and symbols have had such a big impact on how we communicate today in our world. The deaf have always been around since the beginning of time. We just didn't have access to the right instruments and knowledge at times. But as we did start to develop ideas and possibilities, we adapted to the way people lived. Around the 1500s, all the deaf people at the time were usually persecuted because they seemed useless in their communities. But one day, a man named Pedro Ponce de Leon, who was a Benedict monk, created a pattern of signs so that he could have a moment of silence while saying his vows at the same time. For this, he was known as the first teacher of the deaf. Years later, around 1760, a man named Juan Pablo Bonet created a book of all the signs and what they stood for in a dictionary for the deaf based on Pedro Ponce de Leon's symbols. But there were other speculations about how the beginning of sign language started. Others say that people got the idea of sign language from a small town in 1714 called Martha's Vineyard in the island off of Massachusetts, which had both hearing and deaf in the community. The community of citizens, both deaf and hearing, had their own way of communication between the citizens of the town. The citizens would use an arrangement of hand movements and gestures to stand for words and expressions. All in all, this was the first step into breaking the barrier between the deaf and the hearing. After several years, different countries started to notice that there were symbols and hand gestures for these deaf people. So they started to catch on and adapt to making their own way of sign language depending on the language they spoke. For example, in the 1760s, the French sign language was developed and led to the education of the deaf in France. Later, in 1816, a man named Thomas Gaudet brought a French deaf man, Laurent Clerc, who helped develop FSL, to the U.S. to help Gaudet build the first education institute for the deaf in America. After years and years of work, the first school for the deaf using sign language was developed and founded by Gaudet and Clerc. In the school, the sign language was based off of a mix of MVSL and FSL. In 1864, the Gaudet University was founded, and President Abraham Lincoln signed an act that allowed for the establishment of a school of the deaf, which remains the world's only liberal arts university for the deaf and hard of hearing students. But there were not always people who agreed with this way of teaching the deaf with sign language. For example, Alexander Graham Bell really stood for the deaf being taught oralism, which is the system of teaching deaf people to communicate by the use of speech and lip reading rather than sign language. Bell's mother was deaf, and his father, Melville Bell, created this way of communication with a variety of symbols. Bell was invited to the Clerc School to present on visible speech. Soon after his presentation of visible speech, he returned home to Massachusetts to open his own private school for the deaf in Boston. After the establishment of his school, Bell abandoned the visible speech method, and eventually, Bell's name became synonymous with oralism in the deaf community. Years later, in 1880, the Second International Congress on Deaf Education and the deaf educators from all over the world gathered to discuss the pros and cons about the teaching of oralism and the teaching of sign language. After a very long and careful discussion, Congress approved of the teaching of oralism and passed a resolution banning the use of sign language in schools. At the Congress, Alexander spoke for 3 days straight about how oralism could help the deaf community, unlike the advocates of American Sign Language, who were only given 3 hours to argue against oralism. Many people, including the deaf themselves, did not like the idea of having to learn how to read lips. So, in 1890, the National Association of the Deaf was founded. NAD was an organization that promoted the civil rights of deaf individuals in the United States. Created to defend the ability of the American deaf community to use sign language and organize around important issues, all on behalf of the deaf community. Sadly, in 1852, MVSL came to an end. The death of the last member of Martha's Village, Katie West, passed away, which meant MVSL became an extinct language. But that did not mean that sign language would ever stop evolving over time. In 1860, the teletypewriter was invented by Robert Whitbread. A teletypewriter is an electromechanical typewriter paired with communication channel that allows people to communicate through typed messages. A TTY is required at both ends of the conversation and can be used with either a landline or a cell phone. This invention expanded the long-distance communication for the deaf, but that's not where it ended. In 1965, the video relay service was invented by Robert Whitbread. The video relay service was a form of telecommunications relay service that enabled people who use American Sign Language to communicate with voice telephone users through the video equipment rather than through typed text. All in all, the evolution of sign language has evolved over time and made an impact on how people communicate today in our world. It all started with an idea.